whatever. So if you want to share it or watch it again later, just go to our website, thepoetscorner.org, and the recording will be posted on Monday or Tuesday of this week. And if you want, while we're still admitting people, put where you're coming from in the chat. Many of you are people that I know have been coming to our events for 4 years now, 4.5 years now, but many might be new to the Poets Corner. We founded it in June of 2020. Myself and a friend, Catherine Seitz, who, because of her health constraints, she's no longer able to be involved. For these 4 years, my colleague and my nephew, Lucas Adair, has been our very capable technical host. He's here today. If you have questions or technical issues, you can use the chat to direct your questions to him. If you have questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of our screen. That way we can see them outside of the chat. And we may or may not get to questions, but certainly we'll review them and try to answer them afterwards if we can. Recently, Liz Collick joined me on the Poets Corner as our strategy and design director, and she's deeply involved in planning and promoting all that we have coming for you in 2025. But back in June 2020, we were sheltered in, as many of you probably were, and we were desperate for community. And we wanted to create a community of writers and readers of poetry and short prose. Fast forward just 4 years, and today we have almost 5,000 members from all around the world. We host monthly readings, such as the one you're on today. They're free and they're recorded and always available on our website after the event. You can look under past events to see many of the terrific programs we've had in this past year, including Billy Collins, Natalie Goldberg, Richard Blanco, Ellen Bass, and many others. We also host craft talks, workshops, and open calls for submissions that involve a small fee. Mostly the Poets Corner is funded out of my pocket, including the growing costs of bringing these programs to you for free. But it's a labor of love that gives me joy. However, we do welcome donations of any kind and encourage you to join the Friends of the Poets Corner with a monthly recurring donation if you wish. It's most appreciated. Our upcoming events include our first reading of 2025 on Sunday, January 12th, called First Light, Poems for the New Year, with poets Dee Dee Jackson, Alison Luderman, Margaret Haberman, Migwi Mwangi, and Maya Stein, reading from their own work and other poems to bring you the new year in community. Also in January, we have a two-part craft talk on January 11th and January 25th on the poetry of Jane Hirshfield. Hirshfield will be the keynote for our 2025 Camden Festival of Poetry on May 16th and 17th. This will be the third year of this wonderful growing festival that Mark Burrows and I founded. The craft talks in January will be led by Ellen Goldsmith, a professor emeritus from the City University of New York. We encourage you to sign up, explore more of Hirshfield's incredible poems, and prepare to join us in May, either online or in person here in Midcoast, Maine. On Sunday, February 9th, we have Danusha Lamaris reading from her new book, Blade by Blade. And for those of you who would like to delve more deeply into Rilke, especially after today's program, please sign up for the craft talk in March with Mark Burrows called Everything Matters, Exploring the Creative Imagination with Maria Rainier Rilke. That's on March 20th, and the details are under Craft Talks on our website. So, on to today's special event. As I mentioned, this is the 4th year that Mark Burrows has brought together incredible guests to talk with us about how the poetry of Rilke resonates in our lives today. Pádraig Tuama has been with us for each of these events, and we're delighted to welcome him back again today. He was the keynote for this past year's Camden Festival, and I was lucky enough to hear him read his work, talk about the craft of poetry, and sit with him over dinner. And after years of listening to his popular poetry podcast, Poetry Unbound, and reading his Substack entries, I was in a bit of celebrity awe, poet celebrity awe, until I saw him interact so warmly with both the people at the dinner table as well as the dogs underneath the table. What a delight it is to have him back here today. And I understand he has 2 new books coming out in early 2025, Kitchen Hymns and 44 Poems on Being with Each Other. I think you'll want to pre-order them wherever you buy your books. For the first time today, we're joined by Krista Tippett, and what an honor. Her program On Being has touched so many of our lives, engaging in conversations about spirituality that answer a hunger we all have to understand, all want to understand our relationship to living our humanity and a sense of purpose in our lives. She's the author of 3 books, most recently, Becoming Wise, an inquiry into the mystery and art of living. She's a Peabody Award-winning broadcaster, National Humanities Medalist, and New York Times best-selling author. Founded in 2013, her groundbreaking public radio show and podcast, On Being, has been downloaded over 450 million times. I know many of you are on tonight because Krista Tippett is here too. And finally, today's host is a scholar and award-winning translator of Rilke, as well as a poet in his own right and a dear friend and neighbor, Mark Burrows. Mark lives and writes here in Camden, Maine, and travels all over the world to lead retreats on spirituality and the transformative power of the arts, as well as giving talks about Rilke. He's published numerous books, including his own poetry and translations of Rilke and translations of the poetry of Hilda Domine. 2 of Mark's books have just come out in 2024, and you can order them from your favorite bookstore, although we'll put the Amazon links here in the chat. They include a new translation of Rilke's sonnets to Orpheus, and also You Are the Future, Living the Questions with Rainier Maria Rilke, co-written with Stephanie Dowrick. Please join me in welcoming these distinguished panelists, and I'll turn it over to Mark now to begin today's program. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Meg, for that very generous welcome. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are in the world. It's a marvelous thing that we have this chance to meet together across space and across the varieties of time zones and be in one place together, joined around the writings of Rainer Maria Rilke, one of the luminary figures of modern times, and not just in the poetry world, but in the world of spiritual journeying. And I'm particularly delighted, Pádraig and Krista, that you've joined us. This is just an all-star cast, as you all know, And the two of you have worked together on so many projects that it's just a great delight and honor to have you together here on Poets Corner to talk about reading Rilke today. And so we're going to create a kind of a conversation over the next hour and a half or hour and 20 minutes to explore how Rilke has touched your lives, Pádraig and Krista, and mine. What themes drew you perhaps to Rilke in your young years, and how that attraction, how that involvement with his writings has evolved with time, has changed with time, has changed you with time. And so without further ado, Pádraig, let me invite you to open our program this afternoon. You've just arrived back from somewhere, internationally, I assume,
That's
and
true
you're
all the
freshly
time.
back in New York. So
Yeah, yeah.
welcome to you, Pádraig, and
Thanks.
the word is yours.
Thanks, Mark and Krista and Meg and Liz and everybody for being here. And happy birthday to Rilke for the
Yes.
4th of December. So we're a few days late, but yeah. How old is he now? Is he about 150? Is that
Almost 149 he would be.
49?
And your microphone's a little dim. Can you turn up the volume a bit?
Let me see. I'm sure I can. Give me just
Yeah, he was born in 1875, died in 1926. So these next 2 years are big celebrations for Rilke. Next year, the 150th of his birth, and then the following year, the centenary of his death. So
Okay.
a lot of Rilke coming.
So was he born in 1875?
1875 in Prague, in Bohemia, Austria. Not a German, but a
Yeah.
German writer, German
Yeah.
language writer.
Well, I'll always remember that. I was born in 1975, so
There you go.
anyway, so is my audio better now? I just changed
Yeah,
it.
perfect.
Okay. Well, thanks to everybody, and it's lovely to be here to Mark Rilke. I owe all of my interest to Rilke to Krista Tippett because I mean our study of poetry had been pretty comprehensive in school about Irish poetry, and then in both languages, as well as then some international stuff, British, some American. But I hadn't heard of Rilke until Krista made an On Being episode about Rilke years ago. And I think I then, with thousands upon thousands of people who maybe were hearing Rilke spoken about properly for the first time, heard that and then began to pursue various translations of Rilke, as well as any time Krista would talk about Rilke, which is every time Krista talks, it comes up, as you're going to notice. I know Krista well enough now to preempt the fact that this is just like being in a staff meeting with Krista. Rilke always comes up. We have what we might call bingo, but what we can also call a drinking game, based as to when it is that Krista brings Rilke up. So it's true. I mean, she doesn't even deny it anymore. She used to. Yeah. Rilke, Bonhoeffer, and there's a few others too.
Star Trek.
Star Trek. That's right. Deanna Troy in Star Trek. Anyway, I mean, one of my abiding interests in poetry is the what's called the lyric address, which when a poem says you, and what that can mean. And obviously it can mean all kinds of things, because when you just simply, if you were able to simply think about the amount of times you've said you today, who have you said it to? Somebody in the bus, when you're talking to yourself, why are you doing that again? Somebody that you're talking to, somebody who's dead, somebody who isn't alive yet. Yeah, there's ways within which you happens in speech all the time. And I think with Rilke, it's not like he does a psychological analysis of this at all, but the word you is alive and electric and transcendent. And I think in many ways the word you and all the things it can mean, it might be the closest way within which we get to a definition of what Rilke means for God. And that you somehow transforms and moves, and two new yous are created in an intimate connection between you and you. And that's what I think is so interesting within Rilke. Even when he is speaking directly to a god of his poetry, that God is not like any God you'd encounter in a formal liturgy. I think there'd be a lot of people who were drawn to it as well as made anxious by it, because that God is a God of liminal edges, a God of the in-between, a God who was as curious about humanity as humanity might be curious about God. a God who was unmade and made at the same time, in the same way we are made and unmade at the same time, by formulating a you. There's a contingency to the you of Rilke, and I think therefore to the spirituality of Rilke, that is compelling and disturbing for anybody who wants a system. But I think if you're looking for a companion, that therefore is what I find in Rilke, is not anybody who's going to give clarity, but he is going to give a certain echo to yearning, and a certain echo to, I suppose, what you could call tragedy, and to grief, without that seeming like the end of the world. To just say, well, here's what it's like to be alive. He was born into a complicated situation. His mother dressed him as a girl for a long time, and then he was sent off to military school, which must have broken his heart, to have. And he was born into a family of grief. And how did he preserve such tenderness of life? I always do feel very sorry for all of his lovers, and it seems like he had plenty. I cannot imagine he would have been an easy person to have had as a lover. Other people might disagree, but I think he would not have been straightforward. And the way within which his loyalty to love pursued him through his life, in his romantic relationships with women, in his correspondence with his kind of lifelong muse, Lou Andres Salome, and then in the pursuit of God and in the pursuit of art, I find him fascinating. So I thought, with that kind of idea, I thought I'd look at a few poems. We're going to be talking about some of Mark's translations. I think both Krista and I have written blurbs for Mark's brilliant translations. There are many different approaches to translation. I love the way within which Mark holds accuracy when it comes to original text and kind of being a German scholar, as well as then that the art and the yearning is not sacrificed in the name of accuracy. You never feel like Mark's translations are clumsy. They're transcendent. We are going to be talking about some of those in a while, but I wanted to look at some. In preparation for this, I read this book, The Unknown Rilke, which is translated by Franz Wright. I took out a few poems from that I hadn't come across before, and so I thought I'd look at a few of these, because they pick up really in many ways on some of the things that I mentioned there about that. I've got them on screen actually that I can put up, and the reference to the book is on the bottom of each page on the screen, so anybody who wants to find the book after you have placed an order for Mark's beautiful translations. So here, this is a beautiful one. You must mourn for a long time. Lots of these seem to be fragmentary and perhaps unfinished. I also want to introduce New York City to the room, because presumably you can hear my heating making lots of noises. It makes noises from November until about April. There's nothing I can do about it. So you must mourn for a long time. You must mourn for a long time without knowing why, until all at once, in a piece of fruit bitten in hatred, the taste of this grief passes into you once and for all. And by that time, you almost love the taste. No one will ever talk you out of it again. What does that mean? So often I see what Rilke does is he sets up a situation and you think, oh, you're going to bring us out of it. And actually he brings us even deeper in. A piece of fruit bitten in hatred, the taste of this grief passes into you once and for all. But for him, grief isn't something to be gotten through. And of course he knew that, being born into a household of grief and complication in the wake of a child who died. His whole life really was in being a sibling to somebody who he could never know, but yet who people, perhaps his family, looked through him to see somebody who wasn't there. And that, I think, must have shaped a certain psychology of his life. How could it not? So I think this one is beautiful. And by that time, you almost love the taste. I like that he is not frightened to speak about the fact that we need to have a certain relationship with grief. Here's another one. Who can say when I go to a window that someone near death doesn't come toward me and stare and groan and, dying, feed on me? That in this very house, the forsaken face isn't lifted, that longs for me now. Again, certainly in the translation put forward by Franz Wright, there's no full stop, no period at the end of this. And there's no title either. He's just titled all of these named after this. Mark will know much more of the history of these fragmentary pieces, but sometimes I wonder, was this just a first draft that was on a scrap of paper somewhere that was left and picked up, and then translated and taken as part of the corpus of his work? I like the open-endedness of this, that this in a certain sense is a window, because it doesn't resolve itself with a full stop at the end. And again, the idea here when he speaks about someone near death doesn't come towards me, and it isn't that that person has a message for you, but that you are the message for the dying person. Stare and groan and dying feed on me. What does it mean to be in relationship with the here, from the here and now into the transcendent? And that's what I think is so interesting in him. He is unapologetic about speaking of the transcendent, and he does so from a point of view of standing in the here and now. It's a really interesting mix of the tangible as well as the ephemeral, and again that close relationship with death. This one seems to go closer towards God, perhaps, but through the lens of trees. We're drawn to what is unaware of us, to trees which slumberously tower beyond us, to any being for itself, to any keeping silent. But this is really how we close the circle which flows through all we can't possess and back again into us, forever healing. Oh, things, to think you stand so near the stars. We live on, and we have done no harm. I recently, in the last number of years, had to read some phenomenology, and Krista and I were away, and I was trying to battle my way through some Hegel and Heidegger. Krista was kind of first-hand familiarity with lots of these terms. I was pretty lost and bewildered by it. But one of the things that I have managed to retain from thinking about phenomenology is that none of us know what being is. Because how can you know what something is if you're in the middle of it? We are studying ourselves as being, as we are becoming and unfolding. And this, I think, is what you see at the heart of this beautiful piece by Rilke. We're drawn to what is unaware of us, to trees. And I love that slumberously tower beyond us, any being itself, to any keeping silent. And that somehow paying attention to something like that is not paying attention to us, albeit being a breathing being, a being for itself, a silent being, that somehow is a way of looking at through such matters, perhaps into something like God. This is not a God that he speaks of. Normally his God is very, very contingent upon the human gaze and looking back and looking toward, and each being made in the gaze of each other. But there's something here where he speaks to a theological imagination that I think is very, very appealing. I love how this, in the 7th line of this very short piece, that it evolves into something a little bit like a praise song. Oh, things, to think you stand so near the stars. To say that a tree and a star are therefore in conversation with each other, that a star also is a being for itself. It is a keeping silent. And I love the fact that through touching or gazing upon the tree or being in relationship with the tree and pondering that he's actually also pondering something that we might call the universe. In its ontology, in its phenomenology, in its liminality. I'm using all of these words that I hate because I find them so mystical and annoying. But with Rilke, it's impossible to not look at these and to say that in many ways he is a patron saint of being able to take words like that, which are always a failure, and push us into a way to use them without sounding like we're just being annoying and pretending to be mystics. We're not. We're looking at what he managed somehow. I wish I spoke German. I know that both of you can speak to the brilliance of what Rilke's like in the original German. I remember Krista saying once that reading Rilke in German was seeing what somebody could do with German in a way that she had not seen before. I'm sure she'll talk about that. This goes on then, picking up on these. This is just from a longer poem, but this is towards the end of it. Ern's tangled fruit of the poppy is the first line of it. And then the poem ends with this: that unsayable thing which we forever mourn, not like gazelles and deer, which in the future animal complete reappear reliable as ever. What we possess is loss. The more boldly, the more purely we lose, the more... What does that mean? Did he just get tired? Did he just leave that there? All of it. But there's a way within which he has a relationship with the sweetness of grief. And And I think that's a very difficult thing to propose, because where it is that we're able to find a way beyond sadness, we should. I'm not interested in an appeal to despair for some kind of artistic idea, but yet there is a relationship with change and with death that all of us have as life goes on and as things happen that we can't undo. And Rilke, I think, is a friend in that. For the things that we can't change, he proposes a certain kind of liturgical and poetic language that really helps in all of these. And then here's the last bit, one that I'll say. This is a much longer poem, but I think I'll just say here. Yeah, I love this one. Oh, in childhood, God, how easy you were. You, whom I cannot take hold of now anywhere. One smiled on the things one loved to have around. They came halfway, and you were already in reach. And no, my God, where should I travel to find you? Where do I enter? What mountain must I climb? If someone asks for you, where should I point? Where is your rustling grove? Where does your animal wander? Where am I to find the fresh water to wash my face and sex? I have never been clean. What a stunning poem. It kind of echoes one of the Psalms. It feels absolutely in conversation of where can I go from your presence, that somehow he's bringing a contemporary, complicated life in the early part. I think lots of these are slightly later than some of the earlier stuff. It seems to me that these are in the early part of the 20th century. And he's bringing these into conversation, bringing the circumstances of that, the awareness he had that the 20th century, even in the Book of Hours, there's this, often people look to an upcoming century. Often people look to an upcoming century with the idea that it's going to be, a clean slate. And in the Book of Hours, you hear in him going, what's going to happen? It's as if he had this preemption that by looking at the human condition, that he was able to say, are we likely to change? Have we demonstrated any indication that we're going to change? What we therefore need is a way to go into silence in the midst of the cacophony of war and violence that is likely to surround us. And I feel sometimes like he is a liturgist who rewrites things for a very contemporary age, and in a way that wasn't popular. He's not writing poems that are easy to digest or that anybody would want to use in a liturgy, because you'd much rather he be wrong, but he's not. And I love how he brings in this idea of his anxiety about sexuality, his concern about purity, his yearning, his sense of thinking the question of God was so much easier when he was young. And it's not like he had an easy youth, going from one to the other, from a military school, having come from a family full of grief. It's not like there was anything particularly straightforward for him. But he speaks of the yearning for God as if that was easy in his youth. I think he is a person who redefines himself as his language shapes and yearns and looks, and that for him the question of identity was a constant question of evolution and change, and that he went where language took him and he went where yearning took him. So you might have a few things to say, Mark, but that's all I'll say for now. And
Let's turn to Krista first. What a beautiful beginning, invitation really to enter into the puzzles of Rilke, the complexities of the way that he thought. And Krista, I joined Pádraig in saying that you tutored me over many, many years listening to your On Being at a time that there weren't that many people really talking publicly about Rilke in the way that you knew how to do, to bring him into the yearnings that have defined our culture, the anxiety, underneath the anxieties, this deep yearning for spiritual discovery, for wholeness. So thank you. And it's over to you.
Oh, well, that it makes me happy. I will say there was at some point a couple of years ago where I Googled Rilke in the name of a poem, and On Being came up, and I thought, all right, if I've done nothing else, I've put Rilke out into the world and on the internet. Yeah, so I mentioned to both of you, and I'll just tell everyone here that I'm in process of moving, and I have this beautiful small book, which is now on a moving truck somewhere, with I think most of Rilke's poems collected in German, and it's one of my most treasured books, and I don't have it with me. No, well, mine is littler than that. I got it in Berlin a long time ago. But yeah, so what I ended up doing And Mark, I had your book, and it's also in the truck. So, but I just pulled out the two poems of Rilke, which have been are the ones which come to mind for me and have come to mind for me across 40 years. Um, but I will also speak to that matter of Rilke's German. So I discovered Rilke in Germany. I lived in divided Berlin for most of my 20s, which is most of the 1980s. And I still have this memory of pulling Rilke off a shelf in Berlin. And I don't actually remember, these poems I'm going to read to you are poems I discovered later in life. But what I know, well, I'll say two things. And Pádraig, you brought this one to mind. I haven't thought about this before. Um, across the years, and I would say at that moment where I grew up in a very religiously immersive home and then kind of turned my back on that. And when I was in Berlin, I was a very secular person. So that word, but what's interesting to me is that word, the way Rilke uses that you and that God has always has always been resonant for me across the years as my relationship to whatever that word is pointing at, and I would say my increasing understanding of how small that word is for what we're pointing at. But it's always worked for me. It's always landed. Rilke's God, Rilke's you. Um, and I feel like it holds somehow the way he addresses God holds all the things that that word means for us, um, and that God means for us. That's my experience. The other thing that I recall that I was so struck by then, and I never cease to be moved by, is also what Pádraig mentioned, the just the beauty and uniqueness of Rilke's German. And, the qualities that come to mind for me are it is lush and it is playful and it is soft. And those aren't certainly not the caricature of German. And it's so interesting for me. And I think it probably perhaps formed the way I work with English, that it's possible to be both reverent and creative with a language and kind of live the language into places, better, bigger, richer places. Um, and there's one line of Rilke that I memorized back then just because of the beauty of it. And I'm just gonna, it is, and I can't remember where this line comes from, but I'll say it in German because, it's the German that moves me. Ich glaube an alles noch nie Gesagte. Ich glaube an alles noch nie Gesagte. I believe in everything that has never been said. And I think as a person in her early 20s, that was just a sentence to live by. So would you like me to read a couple of poems? Do we have time? Okay. So this poem, so Rilke was with me all those years, a friend, a companion. I think somebody asked about translators in the chat. And yeah, so it's so exciting for Mark to translate. It's exciting to have a new good translator of Rilke because I will say, because I read Rilke first in German, the only of the classic translators I've ever been able to read that I thought did any justice was M.D. Herder Norton.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
couldn't read any of the others, and so I only in recent years learned that M.D. Herder Norton was a woman.
Yeah.
And I had always imagined a man, and perhaps she did not write her entire name because she needed to be taken more seriously. So those translations I trust. And then of course, Joanna Macy and Anita Burrows came along, and you've come along. And these are really the only three that I recommend. And so you need to keep translating everything else that hasn't been translated yet. I love his book. Is it The Notebooks of Malte Lauritbrugge?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, such a beautiful book. Somebody needs to you need to translate that because it is poetry. It's actually not a poem, but it's poetry. So this poem, I read, and this is Anita and Joanna's translation from the Book of Hours. I read this poem on my 40th birthday, which was in the year 2000, and I had just I had been pushing what felt like this boulder up a hill. I had this idea for this radio show where we could speak about this aspect of life and the human enterprise and ourselves, which we use words like religion, religious and spiritual, and where morality is often grappled with, and do it in a way that would be intelligent, that would open imaginations rather than shut them down. And it was just a really hard road, and I mostly was meeting resistance. And on that day, on my 40th birthday, because of everything that had been going wrong, I decided I accepted that this was not going to happen. I just couldn't see that I would be able to push it past this very early pilot phase I was in. But I read this poem from Rilke, and I'll read it to you, and then I'll tell you what it said to me. God's God, and there's that God. God speaks to each of us as he makes us, then walks with us silently out of the night. These are the words we dimly hear. You sent out beyond your recall, go to the limits of your longing, embody me, flare up like a flame, and make big shadows I can move in. I love this next line. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Don't let yourself lose me. Nearby is the country they call life. You will know it by its seriousness. Give me your hand. So, what I received from this poem on that day was that even if this was going to fail, I was going to carry it as far as I could. That carrying it as far as I could was the right thing to do. And, then it actually, I kept going. No feeling is final. I kept going. And here we are, 24 years later. But I had also just recently, when I read this, been working with a teaching that is in both Islam and Judaism, that before a child is born, the angel Gabriel kisses them on the forehead, tells them all the secrets of the universe, then kisses them on the forehead, and they begin to forget it all. And that made a lot of sense to me also as a mother of young children, because you do have this sense of a kind of preternatural wisdom, in a sense that they have secrets that they just don't have words for yet. And I think this image of God speaking to us as he makes us, then walking with us silently out of the night, also echoed that. Somebody's asking about the name. I think in the Book of Hours,
Unnamed.
they're unnamed. So it just look for the first line. God speaks to each of us as he makes us. So that's one. And that poem really changed my life. The other one I actually got also is from the Book of Hours, from Anita Burrows, who is a psychologist. And I interviewed Anita years later for a program we did on the soul in depression. And Anita is someone who has experienced depression both in her mother's life and in herself. And so this poem does, to me, speak to that experience, but I have returned to this in all kinds of darkness, right? In all kinds of life's storms. So now this also does it. So it begins, you are not surprised at the force of the storm.
Mm.
I think this one has a title in places, Onto a Vast Plain, and I'm not sure where that came from. But anyway, either of those, search with them. You are not surprised at the force of the storm. You have seen it growing. The trees flee. Their flight sets the boulevard streaming, and you know, he whom they flee is the one you move toward. All your senses sing him as you stand at the window. The weeks stood still in summer. The tree's blood rose. Now you feel it wants to sink back into the source of everything. You thought you could trust that power when you plucked the fruit. Now it becomes a riddle again, and you again a stranger. Summer was like your house. You knew where each thing stood. Now you must go out into your heart as onto a vast plain. Now the immense loneliness begins. The days go numb. The wind sucks the world from your senses like withered leaves. Through the empty branches, the sky remains. It is what you have. Be earth now and even song. Be the ground lying under that sky. Be modest now, like a thing ripened until it is real, so that he who began it all can feel you when he reaches for you.
Mm.
Those lines of that last section, I have returned to this in so many different circumstances, and which come again and again in life where you just can't imagine a way forward. Through the empty branches, the sky remains. It is what you have. Be earth now and even song, be the ground lying under that sky. It is such a countercultural thing for us to decide to get small, allow to happen what is happening. Be modest now, like a thing ripened until it is real. So I would say those are two gifts that I've had from Rilke. And then also I think, Mark, and I know you've been writing about living the questions, and I'd love to talk about that living the questions. And one thing I love that I don't think people mention enough is that series of letters, which is what Letters to a Young Poet is, were written. The young poet was a military officer who remained a military officer. And I think that's really important. This was a person who wanted to be a poet, like many of us want to be poets, or we are poets. But he wasn't a professional poet. He was a young person searching for vocation, asking what it was all about. And he didn't go down the path of becoming a writer. He went on to live a life in the world, in what might seem a surprising profession, since he has been forever after known as a young poet.
Oh, that's so true. And we finally have his letters. I mean, they've only been
Yes,
released 2 years ago. So
so
Damien Searles
interesting.
did
Yeah.
a beautiful translation, new translation of the Letters to a Young Poet with Franz Kapus's letters to Rilke that prompted the poems. We didn't know they existed. They were in the archives of the family, and they're finally available.
Yeah.
But that's such a beautiful reminder. I mean, because, Franz Kapus went to the same military school Rilke was at as a boy, and it
I
tortured
didn't know
Rilke.
that. I
Yeah.
didn't know. Yeah.
And one day, this young man yearning to be a poet talked to one of his teachers, who said, "Well," and he said, "Have you seen this new book of Rilke?" And he said, "Well, no, I haven't seen this book." And he said, "Well, Rilke was a student here. He was a student of mine, 10 years ago." So that was where the conversation began. So Franz Kapus writes to him and says, "Tell me if I'm a poet. Here are some poems. Tell me if I'm a poet." And the first letter, which was life-changing for me, Rilke writes back and says, "I can't tell you that. That's something you have to find out yourself. Don't look outside yourself to look for your vocation as a poet or as anything else. Go into the innermost part of who you are, and there you'll find what you're looking for." Brilliant, right?
Also, I think he says early on, don't become a poet unless you can't not do it.
Exactly.
And that's also life advice and professional advice that I've returned to again and again.
Absolutely. It has to be the deepest yearning of your life. Yeah. And he counsels this young man, as you rightly said, to become the best military officer he could, to find value in that, and not to renounce poetry, but to do what he's made for.
Yeah.
It's a gorgeous collection. That was really my first discovery of Rilke, and it happened when I was studying in Munich in the 1970s. And I went into a used bookstore near the Heumarkt in Munich, and there was a used copy that was published in 1955, the same year that I was born in. And I picked it up and I spent the whole day reading and rereading these 10 letters. And they're never far from me. They're always on my desk because the wisdom there is not a wisdom of telling us something. It's an invitation for us to discover with him what he's also looking for. And I think that's what's so compelling about his poems. He doesn't declare anything. He invites, he ponders, he doubts, he wonders, and he opens that world of wondering, the confusion of it, and the exhilaration of it, when finally we get a strand and begin to find that strand pulling us forward, right? Is that the way you experience him?
It's a lovely way to say it. Yes, yes.
Yeah. Do you have another one?
Well, another one that I love is one of the sonnets that you translated. So I think we might do that
Sure.
together. Yeah.
Great.
Should we do you want to, and
Yeah, let's do it.
I'm here, I'm not in charge. You're in charge, Mark. I'm just here.
No, this is great. Which sonnet are we looking at?
I will do your bidding.
No, which sonnet? Let's turn to it.
Oh, what was it? It was a Quiet Friend.
Oh, that's the very last.
The
Yeah.
very last, yeah.
What a gorgeous sonnet.
Hmm.
And why don't we hear it in German first, and then do you have the translation too?
I do. I have the German and the English.
Why don't you want to read the German?
Oh,
Or
no,
should I?
actually, I don't have that one. I have
Okay.
I
Let me
have-
read the German and then
you read
we'll
the
turn to
German.
you back.
Yes.
Because you're so right that these are poems. They live in the mouth. They live in the soul, really.
Yeah.
But they come alive in hearing them, speaking them. And even if you don't understand any German, the sound of the poems themselves is a music that you'll never forget.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, well, here it is. Stiller Freund der vielen Fernen, fühle, wie dein Atem noch den Raum vermehrt. And that first line, all those F sounds. Stiller Freund der vielen Fernen, fühle, wie dein Atem noch den Raum vermehrt. Im Gebälk der finsteren Glockenstühle, lass dich läuten. Das, was an dir zehrt, wird ein starkes über dieser Nahrung. Geh in der Verwandlung aus und ein. Was ist deine leidendste Erfahrung? Ist dir Trinken bitter? Werde Wein. Sei in dieser Nacht aus Übermaß Zauberkraft am Kreuzweg deiner Sinne, ihrer seltsamen Begegnung Sinn. Und wenn dich das Irdische vergaß, zu der stillen Erde sag, ich rinne. Zu dem raschen Wasser sprich, ich bin.
May I say, I can hear that you learned to speak German in the South.
I did. Schwäbisch.
Yeah.
My grandparents came from the Black Forest, and
Uh-huh.
when I finished high school, I went to live with them for a year, and
Yeah.
I went speaking German, which I'd learned in school, but I didn't know what they were saying. It was such a beautiful, beautiful dialect, Alemannisch or Schwäbisch. It has all the melody of French because it's
Yes.
infused with French, and all of the sort of tactile energy of old German. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Guilty as charged.
I did. So I'm in your book. I also found the German and the English, and I agree. Stiller Freund der vielen Fernen fühle, wie dein Atem noch den Raum vermehrt.
Gorgeous.
I was also wondering, I wonder if Pádraig, you read that poem. You can't translate Rilke in any linear or literal way. And Pádraig, there was that poem you read that had the word keeping silent with a
Schweigen.
hyphen. What is it? Schweigen.
Schweigen.
Schweigen bleiben or something. And
Yeah.
being for itself with hyphens because there's no way to just translate it directly. But how wonderful to know that you can do that with a language.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, this poem has also been a friend to me. Quiet friend of the many distances, feel how your breath expands the room. Let yourself ring out among the rafters of dark belfries. That which depletes you will become a strength through this nourishing. Go out and in again in transformation. What's your deepest experience of suffering? If drinking is bitter to you, become wine.
Hmm.
In the vastness of this night, be a magic power at the crossroad of your senses, the meaning of their strange encounter. And if the earthly has forgotten you, say to the quiet earth, I flow. To the rushing water, speak, I am. I love that crossroad of your senses. What is that? Am Kreuzweg deiner Sinne.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. What a poem. And thank you for the beautiful reading of it. That opening, quiet friend of the many
Quiet friend.
distances. And often translators have stumbled at that and said, oh, of the great distances. Almost everyone does, except Herder Norton. But it isn't the great distances. It's the many distances. We carry many distances within ourselves, not a great one. We're
Mhm.
full of distances. And what does that mean?
Yeah.
That we befriend the distances that we
Yeah.
carry within us.
Der vielen Fernen.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, that's a better, I think there's another translation in my head, quiet friend who has come so far. But I agree with you, der vielen Fernen is something different.
Yeah.
It's many comings from afar.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then feel how your breath expands the room. Go into your body, right? Pádraig, you're so right. These are so bodily. His poems are physical. When people say, oh, he's a spiritual poet, he is. But precisely because he loves the physical, the body, the physical world, the things of the world, the things of our life.
They're so sensual. I mean, the way that both of you were speaking about the language, that the language itself is a sensual act. To speak his poems in German, I can hear it, but also in English. I mean, when you think of metaphysics and metaphysical poetry, Rilke is a metaphysical poet because he's thinking of these things beyond the tangible, but he's also such a physical poet, and for him the two aren't in any way contradictory to each other. That he enters into the ungraspable through the graspable, and somehow. Like I think he was haunted by distance. I mean, in so many of the poems that we've looked at, and then this particular one, Quiet Friend of Many Distances, and that's himself, perhaps. That's being, that's life, that's God, that's everything, you know. And somehow he has made a friend with that. That can't have come easy for him or anybody around him. But it has yielded lines like this, which are so psychologically astute, and they bring us to, you know, in a way of being able to live with contradictions and the pains and the beauty of the tensions of life. He has gone there before and given us these kinds of lines that aren't a solution, but they are a companion.
Mhm.
It's funny because when he wrote these poems in the Chateau de Musotte, this stone tower in the Valais in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, where he never lived anywhere since childhood, as long as he lived there, almost 5 years until his death. And when Lou, Andreas Salome, his lover early on, his confidant, his mentor, his midwife, his friend to the very end, when she heard his description, she never was able to visit him there, but when she heard his description about how it was a house with no windows, little slats, she was anxious for him because she thought, this is too dark. This is too dark for you. But that image comes in this poem, and he wrote the sonnets in a period of over 3 weeks, in 10 days, 55 of these sonnets. They poured out in 2 parts. And this one, I think, carries an image of where he was writing, because he's imagining here let yourself ring out among the rafters of dark belfries. He lived in something like a dark belfry, but he knew that in the belfry, this is where the bells are. And those little slats are enough to let the sound out. You don't want big windows in a belfry because the bells will be ruined from the weather. So little slats, but that we are the bells. This is Rilke's point. We become the bell. That let yourself ring out, lass dich läuten. Let yourself ring out among the rafters of the dark belfries. What an image, right?
Yeah. Marky and Krista, you both know much more about this than I, but I wonder if you could say something about those intense periods of time when he wrote, a huge amount in the space of, 2 weeks or a few months. The Book of Hours started like that, and Sonus Orpheus, and sometimes there was two intense things happening at the same time. What do both of you think about that in terms of who he was?
Krista, why don't you start off? This is a great question.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't really know that. I've never really gotten into the history of him. Of course, I know about Lou Andreas Salome because that's so interesting. But
Yeah. But that's really true that he wrote all of his great works in intense bursts. The Book of Hours, the first 68 poems, which he first simply called Die Gebete, the prayers. And he gave it to Lou as a gift. He hand wrote it into a black bound journal and gave it to her. And only a year later, he realized this isn't finished. This is part one of something bigger. And so these second and third parts came, but they also came in these 3 weeks, 68 poems, 3 weeks, he wrote them. And they were largely unrevised in the final version. But he did one important thing, and that is in the first version, they're written as if by the pen of an old Orthodox monk who was also a painter or a writer of icons. And there's this whole struggle of how do we speak God? We can't speak God. And Pádraig, you're right. We can address God. You is the closest he comes. And only in 2 or 3 of the poems does he address God with the word God. It's always just you. Until near the end of his life, he writes to Lou and he says, Lou, what I realize is the you I was addressing in these poems was you.
Yeah.
All along. Right? That my erotic love of you and my erotic love of the divine being, these aren't two different things. There's only one love here. Right?
In one of those very late poems, he has this line that I've always thought is amazing, where I think it's untitled, and he says to her, even your not being here is warm with you.
Yeah.
I think that is one of the most extraordinary usages of the lyric address in poetry. Even your not being here is warm with you. And I think his entire theology and his entire erotics are summed up in that.
Oh, I totally agree. And, in some ways, I was giving a talk yesterday on his relationship with Lou in another program, and I reread all the letters between them, 400 pages of letters in the German edition. And what you realize, they didn't spend they spent 3 years together every day and every night. And then they only saw each other intermittently, but they wrote to each other. And these letters are extraordinary expressions of presence in the midst of absence, right? Of reaching across distance and giving voice to the presence of the other. Extraordinary, really. Yeah. So yeah, that line that you quote, that's the way they experienced each other. She experienced him in the same way. And it's amusing that when they would visit each other, the times they were together, Lou would write things in his journal, and Rilke would write poems and things in her journal, which were never published. I mean, they were never revealed until eventually the correspondence was published. Gorgeous, gorgeous poems.
Yeah. Their relationship to each other always reminds me of Wuthering Heights, where there's this one point when Kathy says about Heathcliff, she's speaking to the housekeeper, Nellie, and she says, Nellie, I am Heathcliff. And, Kathy and Heathcliff have no relationship that works on a long-term level, but they are kind of souls who share the same storm. And it seems that Rilke and Lou Andreas Salome have a very, very similar kind of connection, although perhaps less tempestuous, not that I know enough about it. but they shared a being with each other that brought them each to themselves. And even though
That is beautiful.
relationship,
That's absolutely perfect. They shared a being with each other that brought each of them to themselves.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And they understood that. They both understood that.
Yeah, that's what is fascinating to me, is that they understood it and they could move on from the erotic nature of the 3 years and allow all the intelligence of that to sustain them throughout a maturing, lifelong friendship. And that is a friendship in the depth of what an erotics of friendship can be. I think they're extraordinary.
You know, I think the letters to a young poet are not poetry, but of course everything Rilke wrote was poetic. And something I've returned to and given the book away for again and again that I don't think is discussed as often is the beautiful intelligence with which he writes about love and loving and gender.
Yeah.
And you know, he says to a young person that you can't, he basically says you know, you don't rush this, because you have to make it a home inside yourself. And you know, that notion that you also need, like, of a good love, a true love, a mature love, as two solitudes saluting each other. That you want to be as complete, as whole as you can be in yourself, which is very hard when you're young, um, uh, in order to have a whole love. And then he speaks also about in 1903, right? He was writing about the inadequacy of, you know, the disparity in the genders and how it's bad for everyone, and that he could foresee this future in which all of the best qualities of femininity and masculinity are owned by people of both genders, and also, and I think for him also, he was drawn to the feminine, and that was what was dismissed in his world, and often dismissed in ours. And he said, you know, he hoped for a day when one day we would only know, like, the feminine human being. And so I feel like a lot of what he was describing is what is being discovered and lived into now, over a century later.
Oh, that's so true.
Mm.
That's so true. Yeah. I had so many, I mean, his musings about love never ended. I mean, they're woven through the elegies, particularly,
Mm.
where he addresses this straight on. And in this edition, as you both know, the Sonnets to Orpheus, I included 2 of the elegies because they were written, the 8th and 9th were written in between the first 26 that came and the last 29 that came. The 7th was as well, but I included the 8th and 9th. And in the 9th, he's talking about, he's facing what he calls our here-ness, Hiersein, being here.
Mm.
And he coins this word, das Hiesige, the here and nowness, that this is what we have. We don't have anything else. And he resisted the sort of sentimental Christian view of eternal life, sort of pie in the sky by and by, because he felt this abdicated our responsibility to live our lives now and not to wait for something whenever it might happen after death. And so he begins to talk about, anyway, in the middle of this, he says, because being here matters so much, and because all that is here and now seemingly needs us, this fleetingness that strangely concerns us, the most fleeting of all, once for each, only once, and not again. And we also once, never again. But to have been this once, even if only once, to have been earthly, this seems irrevocable. And so we press on and want to achieve it, want to hold it in our simple hands, right? This sense that we want to control it, we want to manage it, we want to somehow direct it. And he knows we can't do this. In our oversaturated vision and our speechless heart, want to become it. Give it to whom? Preferably hold on to all of it forever. Ah, but what can one take over, alas, into that other relation, death? Not the looking that's learned so slowly here, and not what's happened here, nothing of it. well, the pain, well, above all, the difficulties, well, the long experience of love. And that phrase, I mean, I think it's an answering to his early musings as a 27-year-old writing to Franz Kappas about love being difficult. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
an easy path. It's not a sentimental falling in love. It's living into the depth of love, which is tough. It's hard. It's not easy, right?
Yeah, that's another when he says love is difficult, like he says everything that is worth it is difficult. And he says all of nature stretches and strives to become itself, right? That there's struggle involved in becoming oneself, in becoming what you're supposed to be. Um, yeah.
Stretches
And
and
I think
strive.
about that. I think
Mm.
about that all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Kathleen asked in the chat, and it was something that was on my mind too, about the ways within which his focus and intensity on love, and his capacity to give these poems of instruction. You must change your life. I'm critical of contemporary poems that are saying, or in songs as well, you are enough, you are everything you need. Rilke never says that. He says, you're not enough, you're not everything you need. You will die, you'll face your own limitation, and you'll be in conversation with the nothing of the self. And that is, it's a kind of a consoling voice, but there's a brutalism to it too. Like he knows pain and he speaks from that. And I wonder sometimes, is that shaped by him, by being somebody who was living in the first part of the 20th century where there was so much war and rumors of war growing? Was his insistence on love a kind of a political speaking back through an intensely vulnerable and personal lens? Do you think that there was an influence of that, or?
No, I think that's exactly right. Exactly right. He has an exchange with Lou, a letter exchange. He's living in Munich at the time, and she was at the time in Berlin in 1914, just before the war broke out. And he says, I remember a garden in Rome. He doesn't say when it was, but in his younger years. And I went out one night, and all the anemones were closed except one. And it stayed open all night. He said, that's what I feel my life is, that I'm suffering because I can't close at night, because I'm taking all this darkness in. And he felt shattered by it. And Lou writes the most amazing. I mean, she's a psychoanalyst by this time. She's trained under Freud. She's one of the first women to complete a process in analysis with Freud. She writes back the most beautiful letters saying, but your very feeling of this gives to all of us what we long to hear and know, but can't find ourselves because we're all closed at night. We're the anemone, the flower that just closes up and resists the darkness. But you, Raina, you have the courage to suffer this pain of staying available to the dark.
I just looked up that passage from the letters because I was paraphrasing it not well. And I think he's talking before this about solitude, and he says, yes, it's hard and it's also good. And he says, it is also good to love because love is difficult. For one human being to love another human being, that is perhaps the most difficult task that has been entrusted to us, the ultimate task, the final test and proof, the work for which all other work is merely preparation. Loving does not at first mean merging, surrendering, and uniting with another person. For what would a union be of two people who are unclarified, unfinished, and still incoherent? It is a high inducement for the individual to ripen, to become something in himself. Pádraig, like what you're saying, this is so much bigger than be your best self, to become world in himself for the sake of another person. It is a great demanding claim on him, something that chooses him and calls him to vast distances. Merging and surrendering and every kind of communion is not for them who must still for a long, long time save and gather themselves. It is the ultimate, is perhaps that for which human lives are as yet barely large enough.
Wow, beautiful. As yet barely large enough. Yeah.
Is there I've seen a few people asking this in the chat. Is there are there translations of their letters to each other that you recommend, Rilke and Lou Andres Salome, as well as any biographies that you recommend? I mean, when people ask me about biographies, and this isn't just giving vain praise to you, Mark, I recommend that they might want to get your translations, both of the sonnets now, as well as of, Letters from a Young Poet, because your introductory essays are precise to the pertinent parts of his life. So I find those short essays at the beginning of both of those translations, they're what I recommend to people who want a short biography, but it might be that you know of a comprehensive biography, either of you, that you could recommend, as well as some of the translations of the letters.
That's kind of you. First of all, thank you for that compliment, both of you. But the Edward Snow, together with Michael Winkler, did a beautiful translation of the letters between Rilke and Lou. And the introduction is brilliant. Probably written by Edward Snow, who's one of the eminent translators. It's not my favorite, but he's well known, and these letters are beautifully translated. And actually, the best way to meet someone who writes letters, and she wrote memoirs, is by reading them, not reading about them. She wrote this probably the most gorgeous short memoir about Rilke after his death. It was published about 7 years after his death, which there's a beautiful translation by Angela von der Lippe called "You Alone Are Real to Me," remembering Rainer Maria Rilke. And she includes not just excerpts from his letters, brief excerpts, and some excerpts from the poems, but her sense of his temperament, his development, his genius, his gift, not his genius, his gift, and how incredibly rare it was, and how hard fought it was for him not to turn away from it. And I think this is something that we overlook with Rilke. Oh, he was just such a gifted writer. He struggled with his gift, because it wasn't about writing, it's about living. That was the struggle, that anemone that's open all night, that can't find a way to close. What an image, right? And I know, Pádraig, when we talked last year, you chose that poem with the anemone from the sonnets to read. You found that one so moving, and he was fascinated with the anemone and troubled by it.
I mean, I'm struck today by how fascinated he was by bell towers, and that idea. I mean, it's an old idol in some texts. These kind of phallic things that are around the area. The Ashtura Tower that's continually prohibited, that you find in Hebrew Bible. These pieces of that they announce the time, or they announce who's in charge of an area. The poem that I quote too much, but I love it. He speaks about God. I've been circling around God, that primordial tower. I've been circling for 1,000 years, and I still do not know. Am I a falcon, a storm, or a great song? I love the nonchalant way where he just says that primordial tower, as if we all go, oh yeah, I get that. And what he does in the face of putting forward the idea that God is that, he says, but I don't know what I am. And the three things, falcon, storm, great song, are all dependent on air, for flight, or for sound, or for turbulence. And I think what he does in that, the exchange is so rich. I mean, I think for that poem alone, I'd spend the rest of my life thinking about Rilke, but it's just one of the many.
Well, it's right at the beginning of what became the Book of Hours.
Yeah.
And in the first three poems, he the same refrain, I still don't know, I don't yet know. The sense that unknowing creates the space where we can discover something new about ourselves, right? It's not our certainties. In fact, our certainties are the biggest problems that we have as human beings.
Totally.
Yeah.
Are you going to read that, Mark?
Well, I could.
I have a question for you after you do that.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead with the question.
Well, I just, one of the reasons I think Rilke feels like a comrade to us, in a kind of mysterious way, is that he was writing in the young 20th century, and we live in the young 21st century. And you know, as you said in the beginning, he spoke German, but was not a German citizen. I mean, essentially, the entire map that was the map of his world was totally
Yeah.
rewritten by
Yeah.
war and horrors and you know, the war and the magnitude of refugee crisis.
Yeah.
And of course, there was a pandemic, which almost gets buried because it happened amidst all these other huge, catastrophic, civilizational level uh, things. Um, and, you know, we also live in this. I mean, I've been feeling this reading him all these years. And I used to say, well, 20 2014 doesn't have anything on 1914, but I think we're catching up with the 20th century. And so there to me, there's this, of course, he's speaking to us, and as we're discussing, really touching, his writing touches you at a very intimate level, and it is about being a singular human being and having a life. But I think there's also a civilizational, like somehow the connection, the kinship between the intimate and the civilizational is also really alive. It just comes through for me. And, you know, for me, the living the questions advice, which I've taken very personally across the years in this century, is also just a way to navigate all of reality, because we I think we live in an historical moment, as he did, where it's all questions, right? There are no answers, there are no solutions in sight. We have massive transformation that we're called to, that we have to navigate, but we're the generation that only knows what's breaking and has to walk towards whatever, however we remake this. So I don't know, that's a long-winded way. So to me, the live the questions advice is saying, and this is only real clarified for me recently in terms of how I live it now, is when to rush to an answer would be to deny the gravity of the questions.
Yeah.
You just have to live the question. You have to hold the question and love the question and let the question take it as a companion and let it show you. So I'm curious, because you've been living with that text and also living with the sonnets, and I'm curious about how they've worked in you and how you carry them not just through life, but through life in the world.
No, thank you. That's a great question. And transformation is really at the heart of Rilke's whole sense of what it is to be human and to be alive. That is, we're constantly in the midst of change. And we live in a culture right now that tries to resist that at every stage. It tries to give us certainties that are somehow unbending. And in point of fact, everything is changing. We know that from the physics, the new physics. We know that everything is in process, in flow, that we ourselves are constantly dying and being born again in our physical bodies and in our spiritual lives. And I don't think anyone spoke of that as eloquently as Rilke. But can I answer this by just reading a short thing? Because when I was finishing the translation of the sonnets, I translated them first on my own, and then I went back to look at the other translations. And Krista, you're absolutely right. The only one that's credible, really, is Hedda Norton, M.D. Hedda Norton. Her translations are remarkable. And, you know, I have to say that if my translation if it sings at all, it sings in concert with her, in chorus with her. But there was another translator at the same time, an Oxford Don named J.B. Leishman, who eventually translated the elegies with Spender, the poet Spender. But he did the sonnets on his own. And in the introduction, he writes these words, which I think are so prescient. This is 1936. This is the first translation of Rilke into English in a bilingual edition. And who published it? The press of Virginia Woolf and her husband, what's his name? I forget now. They published it, the Haworth Press in London. They had the guts to publish this book that no one else would touch. Anyway, this is what he writes in the introduction. I feel in reading these poems that we have come around the the spiral to another dawn of consciousness, where language is in the making, and where myth and symbol must often supply the place of not yet thinkable thoughts. No other writer is so full of the future. No other gives us such thrilling intimations of that inheritance on whose threshold we find ourselves standing, and which our civilization may be about to enter if it does not perish through its own destructive forces.
Mm.
And that if, I mean, now 100 years,
Yeah.
or 80 years later, that if is such a large if facing all of us. If we don't destroy ourselves and destroy everything that is in our life, in our world, destroy our very world, right?
Yes, I think that I think about that too. I mean, many generations of our species have lived through very dark, catastrophic times, but what the only thing that really distinguishes us is this existential threat of the ecological crisis, which we have
Yeah.
brought about.
Yeah.
But I love that unthinkable thoughts.
Yeah.
What was the whole sentence?
About the unthinkable thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think thinking back to that phrase that's so captured with Rilke that I love, uh, ich glaube, I believe in everything that has not yet
Yeah.
been said, right?
Mm.
And that somehow we are called to live by thoughts which have not yet been by unthinkable by the as yet unthinkable.
Right. And that line arrested me too when I first read it in my 20s. I just thought, how can anyone say this? It's so true, but how could anyone say it? And I believe, not I know, I believe in everything. Alles noch nie Gesagte that's never been said. That's trust. That's trust. And I think to answer the come round again to the question that you asked, Krista, and Pádraig as well, in a sense, Rilke is writing not in defiance of that, and not even in answer to that, but in conversation with that, right? It's different than answering. He's not answering questions. He's voicing questions. He's voicing ways of wondering about life, about my life, my own life, your life, our life, right? And that the address, finally, you begin to realize he's talking to you, to me, the reader. He's not talking to God, you, or even Lou. He's talking to me. These poems become poems to each of us. It's remarkable that way.
One of the things I think is so interesting about him is that, like, he had that military school experience and was living at the time he was living of these terrible wars at the end of the 1800s as well as in in the 1900s, and he just got more tender, and that's one of the things I think is so interesting as an intervention. That, of course, no intervention into hostility and threat is comprehensive, but he knew, and I think he was faithful to what his contribution could be, and he didn't try to make his poetry into manifestos against war, even though in a certain sense they operate as that because of their integrity. He stayed with those questions that drew him, and in the face of rising hostilities and threats, and the imagination behind war is that you're going to be able to make something that won't die, an empire. He went into death, and he went into vulnerability, and he went into tenderness, and he went into reciprocal yearning for himself, for others, for God, for his lovers. And I think that demonstration is a depiction that he knew to stay where he was, and that itself was its own, that he wasn't going to be drawn out of what his deepest vocation was by somebody using hostile language. He was going to go deeper into tender language. Somebody asked who we think might contemporary Rilke's be. There are so many, but Ocean Vuong, who Krista has interviewed, is often spoken of as somebody who, not because he echoes Rilke specifically, although he does in some ways, but that Ocean Vuong's voice and contribution through literature, his awareness of the horrors of, of seeking refuge, of a system that responds to people who are seeking refuge, etc. His awareness of that is firsthand. and his language just rises and rises in its tenderness, not its hostility. So Ocean Vuong, V-U-O-N-G. Krista's done a beautiful interview with him, and then your local bookshop will sell the bunches of his books. So I think it is with tenderness that Rilke responded to hostility, and I do think that Ocean Vuong is one of the people who epitomizes that today.
Krista?
Who who is the Rilke of today? I don't know. I haven't. Probably a woman, just because he would like it that way. Yeah, I don't know. Probably many Rilkes. And yeah, it's just, he lived in such a shifting a culture that was just about to it really a culture and a geography that were about to become unimaginable.
Yeah. No, that's really true.
So maybe somebody who's, as you say, Pádraig, also Ocean has that experience, but
yeah,
there are so many people in that situation in our world.
yeah.
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
And in many ways, I suppose the question.
Somebody said Rilke is the Rilke of today.
Yeah.
Also
Yeah.
true.
And Ocean Vuong is the Ocean Vuong of today. The question is, who is being themselves with their language in public and their authentic selves? And the answer to that is many, of course.
Yeah.
And corresponding with risk and daring, but also not being dictated to by people saying, we need you to be this, kind of going, well, actually, I'm going to do what my deepest calling is. And ultimately, in that sense, that's the vocation of all of us. That's one of the countercultural things about Rilke is that he dared to continue to pursue what interested him in the midst of all of that.
Wow. That's so well said. And I'd wanted to bring a poem early on that it just wasn't appropriate, but I'd like to close perhaps because we're coming near the end of our time. These early poems that he wrote, which came to make up the first part of the Book of Hours, he called them the prayers, as I mentioned. And in the version that he gave Lou, he included these marginal notes in many of them. Often it's just the date, and sometimes it's more than the date. It's the date, and it's a musing about what was happening to this monk. Well, to Rilke, because he's writing his own life here. But the very last one, and when he sent them off to Kippenberg, his publisher at Inselverlag, to publish them all together, he said, I want the notes in. And Kippenberg said, no, because you don't have any notes to part 2 and 3. It will confuse people. And so he acceded. He agreed. And it was a bad decision because those notes are amazing. And the last poem shifts from all of these poems to you to describe an old man. And if you don't have the note at the end, and I've read people commenting, oh, Rilke falls into this tired cliche of God, the old white man. No, he's not describing the old white man. He's describing the last of the Ukrainian bards, which he'd heard about when he was traveling in the Ukraine with Lou in 1899. They were blind. They were the blind ones in the community were lifted up to become the bards. Why? Because they were the ones who really knew how to listen. They couldn't see, so they had to listen the world into being. And their vocation was to carry the songs that they heard from one cottage to the next, from one village to the next, from one community to the next. And he ends this series then, in a sense, by giving us this image that this is our vocation, that we're here to listen for the songs that need to be carried from places of pain and darkness further into the world. And so this last poem is one of my favorites, and it's one that's almost always just dismissed, but let me read just the beginning of it. An hour before the end of day, and the land is ready for everything. Whatever you yearn for, my soul, say it. Be heath, and heath be wide. Sei Heide und Heide sei breit. Be heath, the heath that open expanse, right? Be spacious in your life. Be generous in your life. Be available in your life. And he goes on, I have old burial mounds at your outermost verge, at the outermost verge of God. That's the only you that appears in the poem. As the moon rises above the wide and bygone land, shape yourself, stillness. Shape the things. They're still in their childhood and they'll obey you. Be Heath, be Heath, be Heath. And then, perhaps, the old one might come, the old bard, the blind Ukrainian bard, whom I can barely distinguish from the night, bringing his immense blindness into my listening house. I see him sitting and musing, not beyond me. For him, everything is within us, heaven and heath and house. He'd lost only those songs that he'll never again sing. From thousands of ears, the wandering wind drank them in. And yet, it appeared to me that from somewhere deep within me, I'd saved every song for him. He remained silent behind his trembling beard. He strives to reclaim himself from all the melodies. There, I come to his knees, and his songs flow murmuring back into him. Amazing poem.
Mm.
And I think, if we can end with it, this is really our vocation, right? Is to be those who listen for the songs that are always imperiled, the songs that keep life and love and hope alive, and to look for them not with our language, but with our listening, to listen the world, the songs of the world, the songs of others into being, and then to share them. Pádraig and Krista, what a joy it's been to have this hour and a half together.
Pleasure.
I'm just so grateful to both of you for all you've done, not just in my life, but in our lives, to keep that song alive, to listen for it, and to help us learn to listen with you for it. And the courage that it's taken you to listen yourselves and to make yourselves so available on behalf of so many of us who are perhaps like the anemones that close at night. You've been the anemones that have remained open in the night, have taken in the pain, the darkness, and have made out of it not an answer, but a gesture that welcomes us, that invites us, that praises life with us. Thank you both.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Krista.
Oh, and thank you, Mark. If you've turned off the emojis, you wouldn't see that there are just all these hearts flowing towards the three of you for what an incredibly profound and deep and beautiful program for those of us, people who know Rilke well, and those of us who are relatively new, to be able to listen to the three of you talk so much about how much you've lived with this poetry and with these questions for so much time. It was so rich. Thank you. Thank you, Pádraig, for being here. Krista, for joining us this time. Mark, for doing this 4 years in a row. For all of you for joining us. And if you want more depth about Rilke, please sign up for Mark's Craft Talk in March. It will be wonderful. You just got a touch of his depth of knowledge about Rilke here and thoughtfulness. And that's fabulous. And come back for the Poets Corner in January. And if you want to support us, we welcome any support you want to give. And have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Pádraig. Thank you, Krista. What a beautiful, beautiful gift. Thank
Thanks
you.
all.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank